Okay, welcome everyone. We had a great session last night, and there will be people trickling in, I'm sure, as we get started. More people coming from our group last night and some new additions. I explained to this group last night what the format is, what we're trying to accomplish, so I won't repeat that, only to say that these panels are comprised of mentors and global fellows, the 6 global fellows who've been working on their book projects, and their mentors, and they are going to make presentations about their work, and we will listen very carefully, and there will be ample time for the heart of the matter, in a way, which is the interaction with all of you. So we know you will be listening attentively in this relatively cool environment in Rome, because you're a big part of the program when we turn it over to you to raise all kinds of questions and advance the debate. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to the chair of the first session, my colleague Ebrahim Moosa. Amir is a family chair for Muslim thought and Islamic societies at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. Ebrahim.
Good morning, everybody. There's still some chairs available out here if you want to fill it up so that people in the back can trail in right here. Thank you very much. I'm told that I have to end exactly at 11 o'clock, so I seek the cooperation of my panelists. So good morning and welcome to our first panel, Religion, Post-Colonialism, and New Nations. As Scott already said, he butchered the chair's name, and it's okay, I forgive him.
No, we did it together.
Yeah, we did it together. I'm the Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies at University of Notre Dame. I co-direct today, along with Scott Appleby and Natalia Omer, the Contending Modernities Initiative, which is now located in the Ansari Institute. And from tomorrow, I'll be on my own. I won't be able to blame Scott or Natalia for anything that goes wrong. So from tomorrow, I'm the sole director of the Institute and hope to collaborate with all my colleagues, including Scott, Natalia, and Father Emmanuel. This panel explores one of the central questions in the study of religion and global politics. How religious traditions, institutions, and communities have not merely responded to colonialism and decolonization, but have actively participated in shaping political authority, national identities, and new forms of belonging. The 2 projects before us take us to very different contexts: the Philippines and Uganda. But they ask remarkably similar questions. Both examine the enduring legacies of colonial rule, the relationship between religion and state power, and the ways religious institutions can simultaneously reproduce and challenge political orders. Together, they remind us that post-colonial societies inherit not only political boundaries, but also religious infrastructures, moral imaginations, and contested visions of community. The format of this morning is designed to foster conversation rather than a sequence of isolated presentations. Each fellow will begin with a 5-minute overview of the central argument of the book project, and I hope it will be 5 minutes. Each presentation will be followed by a 10-minute response from the fellow's mentor, whose task is not simply to critique, but to situate the work within broader scholarly conversations and to highlight its significance for the field. After both fellow-mentor exchanges, we will devote approximately 30 minutes to discussion among all 4 participants before opening the final hour for questions from the audience. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first fellow. There is a book with the detailed bios of every fellow. And can you just help me with the pronunciation? I forgot to ask yesterday, Jethro, how do you pronounce your last name?
Calacday.
Calacday. Jethro Calacday is a historian at the University of Cambridge whose work examines religion, empire, and colonial governance in the Philippines. His book project explores the relationship between American imperial rule and the Roman Catholic Church, arguing that rather than displacing Catholic institutions, the United States strategically incorporated them into its colonial administration, thereby reshaping both empire and ecclesiastical authority. Jethro, the floor is yours. For convenience, if you want to speak from there, it's okay, unless the recording facilities requires them to stand up here. Is it all okay? Mahan, is it okay they can sit right here? Okay, thank you, Rose. Okay, you can take it away. Thank you, Jethro. Please give him a hand.
Thank you. Thank you for that welcome. So I'll stick to 5 minutes. As the gruesome Philippine-American War raged on the other side of the Pacific from 1899 to 1902, U.S. President and devout Methodist William McKinley, under the seal of the utmost secrecy, sous le sceau du plus secret, made an unprecedented request to the Vatican. The Filipinos were devout Catholics, but were reportedly hostile to the Spanish friars and bishops in the country. It was demanded that they be expelled and their lucrative properties seized. Note that the Spanish friars, whose numbers peaked to more than 1,000 men in the 19th century, were the main agents of Spanish colonial rule in Las Islas Filipinas. They did not simply function as curas de almas, but also de facto town administrators in the absence of lay Spanish functionaries. The Washington-appointed Philippine Commission, sent to Manila to investigate the conditions of the new possession, headed by Cornell President Jacob Gould Schurman, recommended that American bishops and priests be immediately appointed to quell popular animus. In a confidential note from U.S. Secretary of State John Hay to Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Mariano Rampolla del Tindaro, dated the 25th of July, 1899, McKinley conveyed to the Holy See the religious situation in the Philippines and the recommendations of the Commission. He also nominated Archbishop Placide Louis Chapelle of New Orleans, concurrently serving as papal delegate to Cuba and Puerto Rico, as his choice, as McKinley's choice, to be the Pope's representative in the islands. Incidents such as this are controversial given that, in addition to its history of anti-Catholicism, the United States professes the absolute separation of church and state. How could such contradiction be accounted for? My first book in progress, provisionally titled Catholic Empire, the American Colonial State and the Roman Catholic Church in the Trans-Imperial Philippines, it's quite a mouthful, argues that the emergence of U.S. global power following the Spanish-American War of 1898 was facilitated by the Roman Catholic Church. After formally annexing the Philippines, the U.S. utilized the structures of the institutional Catholic Church to project its power on the new colony. It is my focus on structure, rather than belief, that has led me to argue that the U.S. was a Catholic empire in the Philippines. Indeed, Naomi Goldenberg even argues that religions are vestigial states. Given the Protestant nature of North American power, the advent of U.S. rule in the Philippines, which lasted from 1898 to 1946, and the imposition of the separation of church and state have conventionally been regarded as a rupture from the patronato real, or royal patronage. Now, this system of royal patronage under the Spanish regime, which lasted from 1565 to 1898, had empowered the crown to control ecclesiastical appointments and church property in the islands. As one pundit had put it, Philippine history is, quote, 3 centuries in a Catholic convent and 50 years in Hollywood, end quote. My book radically challenges this view by demonstrating how the Catholic Church remained a crucial force in colonial statecraft, despite the change in regime. I begin by examining how the First Philippine Republic, the short-lived Filipino government suppressed by the U.S. with the Vatican's cooperation, inherited the legacies of the patronato and sought to control the church for state purposes. I then show how this pattern persisted under the American colonial state, which likewise co-opted the institutional church to consolidate its rule. The U.S. exerted a subtle but nonetheless form of imperialism. First, It asserted control over diplomatic relations with the Holy See. Second, it influenced ecclesiastical appointments, particularly the selection of American bishops and the gradual Filipinization of the hierarchy. Lastly, it forcibly expropriated vast ecclesiastical landed estates, or haciendas, and controlled the disposition of their purchase price, whilst also maneuvering the outcomes of landmark cases involving parish properties and pious foundations. I made my case by utilizing underexplored archival sources in both Western and Philippine languages, culled from more than 30 repositories in the Vatican, Britain, Spain, the Philippines, and the United States. These sources include unpublished diplomatic correspondence, private ecclesiastical dossier, financial ledgers, rare periodicals, editorial marginalia, I love, emendations, catechisms, and prayer books. Examining the imperial transition from Spain to the US, my argument is grounded in a rethinking of trans-imperialism to mean the interborrowing of techniques of domination between empires, in this case, Spain and the US. Moreover, I built on the innovative reconceptualization of secularism as meaning not merely the retreat of religion from public life, which is how the term was mainly understood in the 20th century, but rather the exercise of state power over religion in order to achieve that end, following scholars of critical secularism such as Talal Asad, Hussein Ali Agrama, and Saba Mahmoud. Benedict Anderson, who I mentioned yesterday in a question, lamented that the biggest and most obvious weakness of Philippine studies is, quote, the virtual absence of any serious, large-scale study of the Catholic Church, its modern history, its policies and effects, and so on, end quote. My first book hopes to address that lack from the broadest scholarly vista possible. Its ambition is to not merely fill a gap within Philippine studies, but to rethink how we tell and explain the history of American foreign relations and the global Roman Catholic Church from the perspective of what are largely considered as peripheries. From a methodological point of view, given my work's reliance on primary source research, I hope that it might show that older ways of doing history, such as diplomatic history, could be reoriented to pose new questions and provide new answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's fine. I can, there we go. With a little bit of mosaic generosity, Moosa generosity, I let you go for 7 minutes, but I hope everybody else doesn't take advantage. Thank you very much, Jethro. It looks like a remarkable project. Our respondent is Professor Tinio McKenna of the University of Notre Dame. Professor McKenna is a historian of the United States and the world whose work focuses on religion, empire, colonialism, and the Philippines. In today's response, she will place Jethro's work within the wider scholarship on religion, U.S. imperial history, and global Catholicism, while highlighting his broad scholarly contribution. Rebecca.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning, and a distinct pleasure to respond to Jethro's work. And as you just heard, I do so as a U.S. historian who's written about U.S. colonialism in the Philippines, but actually I have to make one correction. I confess I did not study religion. I did not concern myself with religion in that project on U.S. colonialism in the Philippines. And so engaging with Jethro's work really has been an education. I'm very grateful for it. So as you've heard, in 1898, the United States joined the overseas scramble for colonies. It claimed the remains of Spanish dominion, asserting sovereignty over Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In the Philippines, prior to the U.S. occupation, the Spanish missionary had been what historian Vicente Rafael has described as, quote, the most potent agent of colonial rule, whether in the collection of tribute, the selection of natives for appointment to municipal and village posts, or the suppression of sporadic native revolts. The missionary priest was the acknowledged key to the actualization of Spanish power in everyday life. Close quote. So what became of the Roman Catholic Church, which had lost its own territorial sovereignty just a few decades earlier, along with formal diplomatic ties to the United States in the new imperial dispensation? Jethro's answer, as you've heard, I think probably does come as a surprise to anyone with a passing knowledge of US politics in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period defined by efforts to contain democratic participation and bound national belonging along lines of race and religion. Nativism and anti-Catholicism drove both populist and gentile mobilizations, and American Protestants' faith in the nation's manifest destiny and Anglo-Saxons' belief in their civilizational superiority propelled imperial aggression around 1898. Yet, in attempting to pacify and govern the Philippines, US officials didn't look to loosen the grip of the Roman Catholic Church. Instead, as Jethro convincingly shows, they sought to harness its powers. And you just heard some of the ways in which it did that. So from the vantage of Jethro's study, while 1898 may be pivotal in the history of US global power within the Philippines, important continuities with the Spanish colonial era held. The United States proved itself to be, at least for the first decade of colonial rule, no exceptional empire. It was, like Spain, a Catholic empire, which I will recognize as a controversial claim that I'm sure we'll talk about. Jethro writes, quote, "The U.S. mapped itself over the structures of the Spanish Catholic past, borrowing from its techniques of power by seizing control of the church and orienting it to the will of the colonial state." Close quote. So to the question that he poses in his introduction, why did the Catholic Church in the Philippines survive as a powerful institution despite the emergence of the American regime? His answer is actually really, look to Uncle Sam. And one of the principal historical subfields that Jethro's work intervenes in is U.S. foreign relations history. And almost exactly 20 years ago, in our field's flagship journal, Diplomatic History, Andrew Preston, one of Jethro's mentors, critiqued what he called, quote, odd agnosticism about the place of religion in the history of U.S. foreign relations, close quote. Writing about 5 years after 9/11, Preston observed that religion was sorely neglected. And he called on U.S. diplomatic historians who were then absorbing and debating the unique affordances of gender and race as analytical lenses for studying U.S. foreign relations to consider religion. Quote, like race and gender, religion is a powerful force in both domestic and foreign spheres that informs values, norms, and ideas. 20 years later, a vibrant subfield thrives at the junction of U.S. foreign relations and religious history. Studies have tracked the work of missionaries, military chaplains, nuns, and religiously affiliated organizations and individuals in the history of U.S. projections of power and responses to them. Historians have pursued the influence of religious beliefs and practices on decision makers and policy makers, and on how religion has been the object of both. Some have addressed the 1898 period in particular, showing how messianic beliefs contributed to American overseas expansionism. And this is important because for too many historians, in both the U.S. and actually the Philippines too, Philippine history had been summed up in just the way Jethro had quoted 3 centuries of a Catholic convent and 50 years in Hollywood, a line that Jethro has repeatedly called out in his work. Work on Catholicism in U.S. Philippine history is growing, and these studies tend to approach religion as Preston conceived of it, as a force that informs values, norms, and ideas. Or as another historian has put it, Catholicism as an idea, a feature of speech, writing, and imagery produced by Catholics and by non-Catholics. Jethro certainly builds on this scholarship, but he pushes it much further. He takes religion seriously by approaching the church as an institution, moved by collective and competing economic and political goals and needs. Quote, the Catholic Church behaved like a state, and so our analysis of Catholic Church-U.S. empire relations should be on the level of institutions rather than just personal belief or culture, he argues. Through his chapters, both the U.S. and the Vatican appear as organizations largely composed of pragmatic actors. They calculate how to advance particular interests in places and among people, remote from them without running afoul of others. In representing the church in this way, in approaching religion and foreign relations in this way, Jethro isn't preoccupied with belief, private or collective, or Catholicism as an idea. Instead, he explains the objectives, strategies, and tactics of elites by and large, brushing the dust off traditional diplomatic history to pose new questions. We shadow, as you heard, Archbishop Chappelle of New Orleans as he becomes the first apostolic delegate to the Philippines in 1899. We are embedded with the Taft mission to the Vatican in 1902. We pry into confidential correspondence over the appointment of bishops across the archipelago. An account of this kind is possible only with intrepid research in a multitude of archives, and as you've heard, in several languages: English, Spanish, Latin, French, Tagalog, Bacam. 20 years ago, when Andrew Preston was promoting the study of religion, a concern among some diplomatic historians was that race, gender, and religion might be too amorphous, was the descriptor, to meet diplomatic historians' burden of proof for decisive arguments about cause and effect. To my mind, Jethro's empirical approach can put that concern to rest. Through his project, Jethro applies the insights of critical secular studies. He treats religion not as a thing, but as a religious studies scholar, Catherine Lofton, has defined it, quote, a dialectical process by which distinctions are named, sociality is explained, and the relationship to power, natural and supernatural, is managed, close. Secularism, meanwhile, signifies not the declining power and influence of religion, it's the political work of defining religion and its parameters. Or, as Tisa Wenger and Sylvester Johnson have argued, it's, quote, the set of cultural and political systems that demarcate and govern religion, a systematic ordering of knowledge and power that puts religion in its place. This is an operation that has been assumed by imperial powers in the course of conquest and colonialism. In these ways, addressing secularism, that is, the systems governing a process that is religion, includes engaging with the fashioning of subjects of rule and with the recognition of delegitimization of values and practices, all with implications for the distribution of resources. I think a successful and most provocative work like Jethro's gives us much to mull over. Here's just 3 points for possible consideration. First, and this may be more inside baseball kind of question for the historians. If we look beyond the friar lands and ecclesiastical appointments, so the foundations really of Jethro's argument, how might we continue to mark a Catholic empire in the Philippines? The U.S. built a colonial state that organized municipal governments, a property rights regime, leasing operations, public works, public health, and educational initiatives, including the teaching of English. Arguably, the Philippine cleric, who gained ground especially as the U.S. called for the Filipinization of the colonial bureaucracy in the second decade of the 20th century, did not function exactly as the Spanish missionary had. So how might we understand the broader story of U.S. colonial state building in relation to U.S. efforts at pacification and governance that built on Spanish Catholic infrastructure? I think perhaps this gets to some of the kind of questions around the Catholic Empire and its sort of expansiveness, its geography, if you will. Further, how might Jethro's conception of a Catholic empire help us to better understand U.S. colonial policy concerning non-Christians, as they were called, of the Philippines, including Muslim-majority communities in the southern part of the archipelago and animists in the north? Second, Jethro's chapters show that the Catholic flock in the colony could be rather unruly. American bishops appointed with U.S. officials sign-off proved to be complicated collaborators. Filipino clergy juggled competing loyalties. Religious orders forced to sell their lands audaciously challenged directives from Rome. And I couldn't help but wonder then, at times, if the Philippines remained overwhelmingly Catholic despite Uncle Sam harnessing the church to pacify and govern the colony. To take this a step further, I wonder if we might reflect on the reach as well as the limits of an approach to the question of Catholicism's endurance in the Philippines that brackets belief, culture, and lived religion. And then finally, more of a comment than a question, Jethro makes the court argument that U.S. Vatican rapprochement had seeds in the Philippines, where an old world power was ceding ground to a future global hegemon. This puts the colonial periphery, as you heard from Jethro, at least the colonial periphery from the vantage of Washington or Rome, at the very center of diplomatic history. And it certainly shows that a full accounting of U.S. Catholicism requires leaving the mainland and getting out to the supposed periphery. As we do, we'll need to continue investigating how religion and race have been defined and redefined together in local contexts, with far-reaching historical consequences and with implications for how we understand and use these terms today.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Also a model respondent. I should learn to keep it to 10 minutes. Thank you very much. And wonderful question. Jethro, there's a lot to engage with, and that's a great phenomenon.
I'm going to ask the speakers to speak into the microphone. We heard you back here, Rebecca, but you've got to keep the mic close to everyone here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll turn to our second fellow, Jacob Katumusiime. Jacob Katumusiime is currently at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He examines religion, violence, and political belonging in post-colonial Africa. He did his PhD at Makerere University in Kampala. His project argues that episodes of violence associated with independent religious movements cannot be adequately understood simply through criminality or religious extremism, but must instead be located within what he calls the separationist legacy, quote unquote, of colonial and post-colonial political orders. And I'm delighted to also announce that Jacob's got his book contracted to Columbia University Press. So that's a great achievement. Jacob, take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. And let me take this opportunity of my minutes to really thank the Ansari Institute for global engagement with religion for the opportunity to be one of their inaugural fellows. And thank you, Prof. Scott Appleby, and my mentor, Professor Katongole, and the whole Ansari team. Blessings. So, the church in post-colonial Africa is fragmented. Independent religious movements breaking away from both the institutionalized and non-institutionalized church in Africa shape the contours of what many scholars have regarded as a religious resurgence. So, Africa is home to tens of thousands of independent churches. Independent religious movements continue to proliferate the African public life and sometimes participate in violent acts or what continues to baffle the public. So as recent as 2023, over 100 members of a religious group in Kenya committed suicide through fasting themselves to death in what is now called the Shakahola massacre. In Uganda still, in February 2023, over 100 believers of a religious movement, the Christ Disciples Church, disappeared. The search revealed that the members of the religious group had journeyed to Ethiopia, apparently to escape the imminent destruction of the universe that would leave only Ethiopia standing. Social science scholarship continues to grapple with how to conceptualize the fragmented nature of the church in the post-colonial state. So how should we account for independent religious movements in post-colonial Africa? In particular cases, the religious movements have turned to violence. How should we also make sense of the extreme violence that manifests in independent religious movements? My book, The Separationist Legacy, investigates the emergence of independent religious movements in post-colonial Africa and their occasional descent into extreme violence. It focuses particularly on the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God and the violence it orchestrated in Uganda towards the end of the 20th century. On 17th March 2000, between 10:30 a.m. and 11 a.m., the old church building at the MRTCG camp in Kanungu exploded in flames of fire. Over 600 members of the religious movement are believed to have perished in that inferno. In the days that followed, over 400 more bodies were discovered in mass graves at different premises affiliated to the religious movement. Whereas some of the bodies in the mass graves were considered poison cases for lack of visible murder signs, others had fractured skulls, stabbings, and signs of strangulation. The collective death count raised the number of the deceased to over 1,000. So, if the inferno had been initially conceived as an act of mass suicide, the discovery of mass graves changed the narrative to mass murder. The media, state, and scholarly attempts at making sense of the religious movement's violence produced two major complementary culture-talk narratives. The religious movement's violence was either explained as transhistorical, rooted in the ethno-religious traditions of the Bachiga, an ethnic group in southwestern Uganda, or transcultural, rooted in the amalgamation of the social religious or ethno-religious traditions of these people with the Marian and millenarian beliefs. Most of the collective memory thus essentializes the religious movement and its violence as a result of ethno-religious chaotic practices. The discourse's fundamental claim is that the religious movement's violence can be traced within the sociology of the cultural or religious identities of the members of this religious movement. And my book contends with this, because this has produced what Roland Barthes would call a myth, which is always devoid of history. And so my book attempts to give this history and political context. The book tries, I'm trying to negotiate with time here. The book claims, let me move to the book's major claim. The book claims that post-colonial Africa's independent religious movements and their violence both emerge out of the modern colonial state's separationist legacy. The modern colonial state's manufacturing of permanent distinctions between those who belong and those who do not belong to the political community often forced marginalized identities to separate. So the occasional manifestation of violence, which is often of either homicidal or suicidal nature, is also a radical technology of permanent separation. In dialogue with previous scholarship on new religious movements and violence, the book questions the essentialization of culture. It explores the context within which this religious movement emerged and the violence erupted. It illuminates the multiplicities of marginalization within which this religious movement and its violence are thinkable. Thank you.
Wow, Jacob. That was phenomenal. In 5 minutes. Wow. Thank you so much. Wow, you're a very cooperative team here, and I really appreciate it. Otherwise, Rose will get to me. And later on Scott, so I better do my job. Okay, now our respondent is Professor Emmanuel Katongole, University of Notre Dame, incoming director of the Ansari Institute, whose scholarship in theology, ethics, and African political thought has profoundly shaped contemporary conversations about violence, reconciliation, and political imagination in Africa, but especially ecology, and his very strong insistence on the question of the ecological and the institutions that he has created. And Professor Katongole will respond by situating Jacob's work within debates on post-colonial politics, identity, and political theology, and whatever he wishes to say. Thank you very much. Professor Katongole.
Thank you very much. And I have another 2 extra minutes? No?
We'll think about that.
Think about that. Thank you very much, Ebrahim. Thank you very much, Jacob. It's been an honor to read your work, to work together. This is a very, very fascinating manuscript indeed. I'm extremely happy that Columbia University has accepted the book for publication, so congratulations. It's a very, very fresh scholarship that I find on the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. And its main leader, Joseph Kibwetere, who, as he mentioned, on March 17, 2000, led all the members in this inferno at Kanungu, and then eventually they found other sites where members of the movement were buried, which helped the state immediately by issuing criminal charges against the founder and started a manhunt for the leaders with cash prizes for anyone leading to their arrest. Where I find Katumusiime's book fresh, that it argues that the attempt to criminalize the violence by locating it within the cultural, religious, spiritual, or charismatic agency of the leaders of the movement are inadequate, misleading, and misguided. Such independent religious movements and their violence are only thinkable within the separationist legacy of Africa's post-colonial modernity. To unpack a little bit about this separationist legacy, colonial politics defined the political belonging along exclusionary, tribal, ethnic, racial, or religious lines, and thereby naturalized and politicized existing identities, while at the same time inventing new ones, new identities along those lines, and pitting them against each other. This imagination of exclusionary, separationist identities became a key founding block for Africa's post-colonial nation-state politics. Accordingly, an ongoing crisis of belonging lies at the very heart of Africa's post-colonial politics. The violence which occasionally manifests itself in independent religious movements just reflects and drives out of this crisis of belonging and separationist legacy. What Katumusiime's book also helps to highlight is the extent to which religious and mainline churches have by and large simply assumed this separation legacy of nativism and belonging according to tribe, ethnicity, and ended up just reproducing it within their own institutional, hierarchical, and pastoral arrangement. He has a very, very fascinating case of the Archdiocese of Mbarara and the creation of the new dioceses in Uganda. So it is within this context that we can see Joseph Kibwetere and the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments as a response to and a reaction against even an attempt to overcome the separation politics of both the state and the institutional church. In this case, the movement can be said to be read as an experiment, a failed experiment in reimagining belonging through a religiously inspired vision and practice. What is tragic is rather than providing a credible response and an alternative to the violence of the separationist legacy, Kibwetere and the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God simply radiated and reproduced the same violence, which only confirms the ongoing and pervasive nature of political identities. But that is also the reason why, and I find this a very, very compelling argument from Jacob's book, that is the reason why movements like the MRTC, the Shahar Massacre, the Christ Disciples Church, and the other independent movement should be taken out of the spiritual, cultural, and theological doctrinal prism within which they are often studied and located within the ongoing crisis of belonging at the heart of Africa's post-colonial political modernity. A unique modernity at that. So more than the need for more legislative efforts to protect innocent believers from these dangerous, poisonous forms of cult religious fanaticism, more than police efforts to hunt down the self-seeking criminals masquerading as religious leaders, MRTC and similar movements point to the much-needed effort for political reform in Africa. So by employing a criminal justice lens, responding to the likes of Kibwetere, both the state and the institutional church conveniently avoid this much-needed call for political reform. It's a powerful argument, beautifully written, interdisciplinary in so many ways, but also raises a number of important questions about the nature and possibility of this political reform and the need to overcome this separationist legacy of identity politics. If the nation-state separation legacy has bequeathed to post-colonial Africa an ongoing crisis of belonging and recurrent patterns of exclusionary violence, if mainline churches have not been able to question this heritage and in fact just located themselves within it and thus reproduced its identities and exclusionary politics, if independent movements like the MLTCG, in an attempt to overcome the exclusion and violent politics, end up reproducing the same, then how do we go on from here? how does a much needed political reform look like? What would it mean to reimagine post-colonial politics beyond identity politics, beyond nativism, beyond the separationist legacy? These are the kind of questions that Jethro's book raises. In his conclusion, Katumusiime points to the need to move the discussion from a focus on criminal justice, Kiwetere and others as criminals, to attend to the more comprehensive need for survival justice. However, even as he points to this notion, the elements and the full implication of survival justice, I find, are not yet fully laid out. Does this notion of survival justice include or encompass the need for political reimagination of the nation state? What would it take to reimagine new forms of citizenship and belonging? New forms of belonging that does not assume nativism, ethnicity, or tribe. Are there any such examples? Where? These are questions that I find the separation legacy raises, even though a full-fledged proposal for reimagining post-colonial politics is definitely beyond the scope of Katumusiime's current project. I would have loved to see some guideposts where this leads. Perhaps this is an indication of a future project. Provide some more concrete guideposts, examples of how this kind of reimagination of this post-colonial modernity beyond nativism might look like. And I suggest, by way of conclusion, that perhaps in his next project, he will engage more fully some of the works of African political theology, where scholars like myself and others have been grappling with these kind of questions, and also providing examples of how such a reimagination from a theological point of view might look like. I'll be happy and I will not be surprised when Jacob in his next project undertakes this positive direction in his work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Katongole. You did not use the 2 minutes you asked for. But it's okay, you can have a longer answer. I cheated on the stopwatch. I started you 2 minutes later, but you finished on time. So that's great. He's my boss, so I have to defer. So, yeah, this is a great set of questions and interlocutions for 10 minutes. No, what was the time? I said we're going to spend some time talking with each other. Jethro, Professor McKenna posed a couple of questions to you. I'm wondering if you want to take the opportunity to respond to them if you could. There were like 3 or 4 questions that I heard. And Jacob, Professor Katongole also raised a number of questions, especially in Jacob's case, given my South African connections. I wonder, Jethro, Jacob, if you, in any way in your book, touch on the kind of the Xhosa cattle killing, movement of Xhosas in the 1850s, the Maji Rebellion in German East Africa, Alice Lenchina's Lumba Church in Zambia, and various other movements. I know I think Professor Katongole might disagree, but religious studies scholars have a kind of a different notion of millenarianism in different contexts, not only in Africa, but also in North America, Jonestown, different kettle of fish, but also around the Middle East and other parts of the world. So there's a lot to discuss, and I'm sure the audience also can raise some of those questions. So Jethro, take it away.
Thank you, Professor McKenna. That was very generous. Actually, there are a couple of questions. So the first question that you asked was beyond the cases that I study in the current book, which focuses on ecclesiastical appointments, diplomacy, and the church property. How did this Catholic empire continue beyond that? And I have to confess, I have to give some context to to this project. When I was conceiving it in my mind 5 years ago, when I was applying for PhDs, during the title defense, I envisioned 12 chapters for the dissertation. So when I went around the world, circumnavigated the world for my archival research, I collected enough materials for that project. So, but because the Cambridge dissertation has a very strict word limit, I had to just write the first half. And so I decided, because the first draft of my chapter 1, which was on the Philippine Republic, the first iteration of that was around 40,000 words without notes. So I said to myself, I have to cut it, and I decided I'll just focus on the state. So the focus of the book, this first book, really is on how, that state-to-state sort of functioning. But indeed, there is something to be said about the logic of the Catholic Empire beyond that high politics. And that is what I want to explore in the second book. 70% of the materials I already have with me. So one of the areas that I'm really sort of interested in investigating is, for example, the creation of a civil registry, right? In the Spanish colonial Philippines, despite the fact that the Spanish colonial government had pushed for a separate civil registry, because of the pressure that was exerted by the friar missionaries, that did not happen. So all of your registries for like baptisms, for your burials and marriages are all in the Catholic parish. And so I want to look at the history of that, the disentanglement of that during the American colonial regime. And so, how did they think of births beyond baptism, for example? Or how did they think of burying the dead? So that sort of question. The other area that I'm also excited about is political journalism. During the Spanish colonial period, there was a lot of censorship in the government. So there was a press, but it was not as free, and the friars were always employed to be the censors of not just newspapers, but also plays and dramas that were performed. Now, following the fall of Spain, you had a proliferation of print culture in the Philippines, not just vernacular prayer books, but actually political tracts. And so Filipinos, for the first time, were like printing materials freely. And under the American regime, that continued on in many languages, at least in the 8 major languages of the country, not including Spanish, which is still the language that was used, and of course, increasingly, as the decades passed, in English. So I want to trace the history of that political journalism, because the Catholic Church was in the midst of that, and they were articulating a particular kind of idea of what it meant to be Catholic under a Protestant power. I touched some of that themes in the current book. In fact, I have to share with you that one of my claims in the book is that the Vatican's acceptance of the separation of church and state, paradoxically, happened not in the Second Vatican Council, which happened decades later, but in the Philippines, in the first provincial synod of Manila, which was convoked to sort of sort out how the church was going to be managed. There was a series of paragraphs that dealt explicitly on the separation of church and state, and the Vatican signed off on, okay, we can have separation of church and state, the priests could encourage free elections, etc., etc. And so, you know, I want to look at the history of that. What does that mean, you know, when the church is engaging those ideas? You know.
So, thank you. I would, if Professor McKenna had comments, I'll give you a chance to mull over it if you had more comments for him, but I'll move to, before I move to Jacob. Jacob, one of the interesting things that your paper, Jethro, one of the things your paper generates is that you think of 1890 as a pivotal, in the US as a kind of a Catholic empire, right? But there would be an interesting question how the US state instrumentalized Catholicism in its overseas foreign policy. But how did the US state treat Catholics domestically? That's an interesting question. You can mull over it and come back in the next round. Jacob.
Great, thank you so much for the very generous and inspiring comments and very provocative questions. What is the nature of political reform that we imagine? How do we go from here? Well, these are questions I'm also grappling with. I don't know. So, in the formation of priests in back home, and in the Christian tradition, there is a popular song, priests in their formation now. When he calls me, I will answer. When he calls me, I will answer. When he calls me, I will answer. I'll be somewhere working for the Lord. That song doesn't imagine any permanent places of service. These priests come from different dioceses, different tribes, different lands, and so their imagination of their ministry is translocal. However, when they finish their course like this, and they are posted back to their dioceses, their particular dioceses, and for them to move from one diocese to another, the bishop, I don't think even would easily accept that. It is unacceptable, it is unimaginable. However, there are dioceses that have tried to break away from that. One of those dioceses is the Diocese of West Buganda. Now this is the Anglican Church. The Diocese of West Buganda, they have refused again and again to elect as bishop a native. And partly it's because this particular diocese is a multi-tribal diocese. So it has many immigrants, recent immigrants, very many of them, that the choice of a bishop, local bishop, becomes so difficult, becomes so intense. And the solution has been to imagine a bishop always and again from somewhere else. Because if you elect a bishop from that land, there's going to be this tribal conflict, fight again and again. And so of course, they are also still conscripted because regardless, since the main language in the area is Luganda, they imagine Ganda-speaking bishops from different parts of the Ganda identity. So one of the ways could be continually taking this song seriously and posting bishops, priests in places where they don't belong. And if we want, we can do it, because why not? They can be taught to learn very many languages. One of the arguments is that they can't speak the languages of the different societies. Why can't they learn the language? Why can't theological schools start to say a bishop, a priest should be able to speak 3 languages at least? Yeah. The Catholic Church had the opportunity to reform this during Vatican II. And one of the major points was that let's have local, local production of local priests. The challenge that the Catholic Church did not envision is how these post-colonial states in the formerly colonized world were already conscripted in this production of very rigid identities. So when you say, let's produce local priests, take care of, then you imagine local priests as only native to that particular land. The Anglican Church did not have the opportunity because in most of the colonized world, especially British colonies, the Anglican Church was a religion of the state, so its functioning was the functioning of the state, its imagination of identities. But the Catholic Church had that opportunity. However, and now that's the challenge also, that there's this Loma Occulta Parafinita. When Rome has spoken, when the Pope has spoken, the matter is finished. Now, what that does in the local context is that when they are selecting bishops, when the name is sent to Vatican, and there's always a major recommendation. Most of the times, the recommendation is native to that particular land. When the decision comes back, no one can question it. So if there can be a decentralization that, it needs courageous, bold thinkers in the church and in the state, I think for now. I don't know how to think about it. And the question you asked, I engaged some of these, not like expulsively, but I touch on the sidelines of the formation of these movements. I don't have answers.
No, that's great. At least you framed it in that way. Well, what I can say is this morning's panelists and two presenters set a whole stand. Anybody from the Vatican out here? Michael Dreesen is here, so I hope you're getting the messages to the relevant councils. Both of these guys have really good chutzpah, no? I mean, really, they really raise the bar in terms of questions. Rebecca, you want to? If you have a comment, and Father Emmanuel, you too, after Rebecca?
Well, I think just a kind of couple things. I'm glad it didn't turn out to be a 12-chapter dissertation, because maybe you wouldn't be here had that been the case. So good. I'm glad that there was a word limit. I don't know if I have like a kind of an argument or a really kind of great kind of reply to your response to my question, but maybe more questions in some ways. And I would be curious to know what you find as you kind of dig into this issue of civil registries and political journalism that you've cited as kind of potential places to continue seeing a form expression of the Catholic Empire. And I suppose what I'm thinking about here is it this state kind of assuming kind of functions that had been those of the church. And I got to sort of think, you and I had never talked about this, Jethro, but almost a Foucauldian pastoral kind of power. Is that sort of what, where or you might be headed there? Is it a delegation to the church of those functions? Does the church continue? And then I suppose too, I guess what I'm thinking too is what are the repositories of and the institutions that are producing the political kind of journalism in this kind of, American kind of period? Are they highly centralized? Are they hyper-local? Again, just as we try to kind of work out the texture of what colonial rule kind of looks like, I think those are questions that come to mind. Or is it a more syncretic kind of relationship between church and state that you sort of see manifest in civil registries? And again, these two kind of sites that you talk about. I could sort of say something, but I think the question is too about Catholics in the United States in this period, and I'll just sort of maybe kind of add on to it. I've wondered a lot about the boomerang kind of effect of Americans kind of harnessing the Catholic Church in the Philippines in this period and what that meant back in the States. I mean, we could sort of be thinking about immigration restriction in the United States, of course, in this period, which was a way not just of kind of trying to kind of put the brakes on immigration of Southern kind of Europeans and folks from Italy, but it was also, of course, there's an anti-Catholicism kind of dimension, of course, to that too. But in any case, I did kind of wonder, is there any kind of boomerang argument? It sort of seemed to me from your project, what I was sort of sensing is that the impact on the U.S. had more to do with kind of Americanization, like the impact of the sort of Philippines on, kind of U.S. kind of Catholic Church, very kind of internal to the Church. But maybe there are kind of consequences beyond that you kind of wish to speak to also.
Jethro, why didn't you go? Do you have a publisher yet? Who are you talking to?
Should I divulge?
Okay, no, that's fine if you don't mind. I would recommend the Contending Modernity series at the University of Notre Dame. Two editors are right here. But that's just a generosity on our part. But you might want to go with Columbia or Yale or Harvard. That's fine.
Yeah,
but Notre Dame is, I mean, Harvard is the Notre Dame of the North, right? I mean,
well, in terms of just publishing, my principle is just I want to finish the manuscript before I actually write the proposal. So no manuscript, no contract. That's my personally imposed rule. But anyway, I missed one question from Rebecca, and it's about the non-Christian and non-Catholics. This is also something that I want to tackle in the second project. It's like the politics of religious freedom, because I make a very rigid distinction. I don't know if it's like to a bad effect of making a very rigid distinction between religious liberty and neutrality and all that. It's, because my Cambridge mind wants like, okay, this is it. But anyway, that is a constitutive chapter of the second project. Although I tackle it slightly in the first project when I talk about the schismatic Philippine independent church. How the American colonial state and the Catholic Church actually cooperated to suppress this movement, which was gaining a lot of followers. Like with a population of like 6 million in 1900, half of the population turned to the Philippine Independent Church. So the Americans were quite terrified by it. Unruly Catholics, and I think the question there was, did the Philippines remain Catholic, despite the U.S. not coming in? And I would argue because of the presence.
The very kind of presence kind of creating, I guess, an abundance of microphones. I guess I sort of wondered to what extent did the U.S. kind of harnessing the church actually kind of create, what Amy Kaplan would call a sort of anarchy, kind of create more kind of trouble in a way, and so the hold of Catholicism actually kind of maintains despite Uncle Sam, it's a kind of surprise in light of the ways in which Uncle Sam was kind of trying to sort of take the wheel. So its hold maybe, and I guess the kind of larger kind of question here is, one of the kind of major kind of principal questions that you ask in your introduction is, how do we sort of explain the endurance of Catholicism in the Philippines when you think of it's a Protestant empire, that that's your kind of principal question. And so I guess I sort of my kind of point would be like, in part, do we have to sort of look to kind of ordinary kind of Filipinos and kind of lived religion and the kind of continued hold of kind of Catholicism, even as Uncle Sam is trying to instrumentalize the church. So, what are the other explanatory forces that we might need to sort of think about to understand? Yeah, it's continuing.
Just like a similar kind of question. So while you have flipped the whole question about religion, not about belief, and I mean, you didn't say that, but normally the orthodoxy in religious studies is that, it's not only about belief and doctrine and so on, but it's also what you unpack is the political institutions, etc., or the social infrastructure. But what kind of, with Rebecca, is the question about then what is the role of Catholicism in the lives of day-to-day, Catholics, right? I mean, there's a presence. Lives and realities are formed around it, etc. And I often wonder that in our redirection of how politics, our religion is politicized, etc., we forget the day-to-day work that religion does. So once I get back your comment briefly, hopefully, to Rebecca and me, then we want to switch over to Father Katongole.
Yeah, I'll because the questions that were posed to me subsequently, they are all related, and it really is pushing towards like the other side of the equation, which is like the cultural, the social, and all of that. And yes, the Catholic Church has a profound role in the lives of people. I mean, we have a saying in Filipino, KBL. I mean, KBL was a political party of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos in the 1970s and 1980s. That's Kilusang Bagong Lipunan. It's called the New Society movement. But for the Catholics, it's Kasal, Binyag, Libing. It's like marriage, baptism, and burials. So the lives of ordinary Catholics are framed around all of these like sacraments, in addition to a horde of processions and pious practices. So under the U.S., that was that continued, and I would agree with your comment that it's paradoxically because of the U.S. coming in that these things were continued to be done. Because in my first chapter on the Philippine Republic, I show that the policymakers of that republic imposed quite a strict regulation of religion. So, for example, the church could only own a property that was to the max of 50,000 pesos. So that was a law. The clergy that could serve in the country should only be those that were answerable to the local bishop, i.e. natives. So that was a law. So there was almost a stranglehold of the government over religion. Right. I also want to make a comment about how what all of these things in the Philippines, what all of that had to do with domestic U.S. Affairs. And I would argue that it's because of 1898 and the centrality of the Catholic Church there. A lot of like American Catholics at that time, I won't go into that can of worms, they use that sort of moment to assert their being part of the body politic. All of us in this room would be familiar with Americanism, and paradoxically, Americanism was condemned in 1899, just as the U.S. was, interacting with the Vatican in such a way. So that was, it had profound effects because it proved to the movers and shakers of government that yes, the Catholics they could be useful in the mainstream politics. I won't go into that anymore.
Thank you very much, Father Katongole.
I won't take much time because I want to hear the audience.
And we'll throw it open immediately after that.
Yeah, but I like your response, Jethro, in response to the reimagining that we could begin even with that kind of the songs, the hymns, and the Vatican structure in a way that kind of really places itself broader than any national, local, tribal identities. But one key takeaway that I take from your book that I see is it has implications for the way political theology and political philosophy is done in Africa, especially around the whole question of tribe and identity. We have always argued that tribalism is not the problem in Africa that it is assumed to be. That it is all these Africans are so live in tribes and now and again kind of fight because of tribal loyalty and identity. That to understand these kind of so-called ethnic tribal violences, you have to locate them on the landscape of this unique political modernity of Africa, and how these cultural identities became politicized, deployed at the service of the new nation-state politics. That for one to become a Ugandan, you have to be a member of a tribe. There's a tribal identity that kind of brings you into Uganda. And so the nation state kind of already also providing a narrative that it is actually the salvation to all these kind of tribal identities. Thereby not only imagining, but actually creating the very tribal violence, which is supposed to be a savior. So tribalism kind of being written within the very framework, within the very modernity, unique modernity of nation-state politics. And so it kind of becomes a never-ending, in a way, project of reconciliation, of mediation, and so forth. But without ever questioning that, because it has been now naturalized. And for most of us say, well, what can I do? This is my natural identity. I'm born of the... So I think the work that we're doing is really raising these kind of questions, the same argument that you are making around this religious movement, the violence of religious movement, is a similar argument that needs to be made, that has been made. So I see the implication of your work within a broader discussion of post-colonial politics, and especially with this whole question of tribalism. Just wanted to make that comment.
Jacob, tafadhali in Swahili. Please continue.
What can I say? Perhaps to really thank you for validating the work I'm doing. And indeed, one of the questions I missed, one of the adverses, is reading African theologians. Yeah, I'm going to do that. In the revisions of the book, of which I've given a deadline of September, that will be in. I'll see how to engage African theologians. The only challenge I've encountered in engaging theologians is a moment reaches and we moralize discourse. It becomes a moral question rather than a political question. But I'll see how to take out the political and infuse, because the nature of the state is always going to determine how things operate. Malcolm X imagined that the Nation of Islam was the only solution to the state violence, to the repression, to the oppression, and so the challenge. And in fact, this is one of the things the book does, that it shows you that separationism is conscripted. What you're talking about is still conscripted, and this conscription also makes it a political constituency that is used by state actors. Because if you break away as a religious movement, you shall become a political constituency that can be banked on for electoral victories. So use remaining there can be advantageous for the state. So the state gains from these separationisms. Yeah, I will engage theologians because the advantage is they think universally. They don't think in these very tribal, politicized terms, local terms. They tend to think universally. So, yeah, thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Jacob. And I really liked you singing. It was very nice. Thank you. I want to throw it open to the audience. Please introduce yourself and pose your question or comment. Professor, is there going to be mics for the speakers, or should they just speak loudly?
No, we'll take a mic.
Okay.
You have plenty of mics on the stage. Too many.
Thank you. I'm Timothy Matavina from Notre Dame, and thank you for a wonderful session. Jethro, if you don't mind a kind of a broader comparative question, I'm just really interested in this. I don't know whether this takes you beyond what you've done, but the United States gets 4 colonial land holdings from this war. Does comparison of the imperialistic strategies in other places in any way sharpen your analysis? I don't know how much you've seen, I'm just interested in what you might be able to say. One could imagine for, Cuba was already under a war of independence for 3 years, so they get a kind of quasi-independence, although the Platt Amendment keeps them under colonial control. Puerto Rico becomes the one kind of permanent possession because the United States needs a port in the Caribbean to defend its military and other interests. Panama Canal is coming just a few years later. So there are different things going on. I imagine part of the dynamic of the Philippines is it's so far away and there are so many separate islands. It almost sounds to me like a begrudging Catholic imperialism because it's the only way you're going to do anything there. But I'm interested especially in the Puerto Rican Philippines comparison because while they're launching this Catholic imperialism, the same government is simultaneously aggressively and quite successfully turning Puerto Rico into the more Protestant possession, Protestant place in all the Caribbean and Latin America. So what kind of a conscious level, have you seen anything in your study that they're sharpening the different strategies for these different, and how does that help maybe sharpen your understanding of the particular Catholic overtones of the Filipino case? And I'm really curious about one very specific thing. While the Americanist controversy is being resolved, while they're writing the Vatican to enlist their support in the Philippines, they are very publicly government funding is supporting these Protestant missionaries and Catholic missionaries too, because they want U.S. clergy and bishops in Puerto Rico. Are they conscious of the fact that they are doing this and that it might upset the Vatican if they kind of know they're trying to take over the Catholicism of Puerto Rico while they're trying to use the Catholicism of the Philippines? Is there anything in the stuff you read from the State Department or the President that shows a consciousness of how they had to operate clandestinely or any other ways to accomplish those simultaneous goals, which of course are all about control of their new possessions?
Thank you, Doug. We can take a few more questions, comments. Dreesen?
Oh, thank you very much. Michael Dreesen, John Cabot University. Wonderful presentations, and it was really great to read your work throughout the year, so just wanted to thank you for that. Just two quick questions. One, I'm just going to do a twofer on Tim's question, and just publicly ask you to sort of, defend the idea of Catholic Empire. So I'm still not totally at ease with that term. So why are you using that term? And I was just thinking, just to sharpen the question, when I think about France in Algeria, it's regulating and controlling muftis. When I think about the Ottoman Empire in Greece, it's regulating and controlling the Orthodox bishop appointments. Great Britain is trying to regulate, and we wouldn't call those a Hindu empire or a French Islamic empire. So why Catholic empire? And is that trying to make a claim about these other empires as well? Should we be thinking, is this part of the claim? Should we be thinking about France as an Islamic empire, Great Britain as a Hindu empire? So just want to push you on that and defend. And Jacob, fantastic, really, and the exchange with Emmanuel I thought was really fruitful. I was wondering about the theology of this group. So in many ways, your analysis is focused on the reaction to the state, the way in which they reproduce the violence of post-colonialism. Very compelling. But there's also this personal rivalry, so that this is also a way in which a local responds to not getting an appointment. As you read and analyzed, did something emerge about their theology, the actual religious claims that they're making? And does that, in all of its violence, and as a response to the post-colonial state, was that also offering some kind of imagination of what a post-colonial, a different kind of a state? Is there something in that theology itself, violent as it is, offering us something to rethink the religious landscape and political landscape there in Uganda? Thank you very much.
Yeah, we got 38 minutes for questions, so I see Professor Aaron. And any other hands that I need to recognize? Thank you.
Thank you both for a wonderful session, and thanks to your mentors for their really great comments. My specific question is for Jacob. So Jacob, some colleagues and I have just finished a research project looking at cross-cultural understandings of the right to freedom of religion or belief in Kenya and Indonesia. And as part of the interviews that we conducted in Kenya, the Shakahola massacre loomed large. and we ran, at the very end of the project, we ran a workshop with local religious leaders and actors discussing how to respond to something like Shakahola, because there's a lot of discussion going on now about regulation and whether and how religion in Kenya should be regulated and all this sort of thing. And so my question for you, because we've been playing around with, okay, so how do we look at this through the lens of harm and sort of, the self-improvement theologies and technologies. But my question for you is, what are the policy, legal and regulatory implications of viewing these movements not through the lenses of criminalisation and extremism, because that's of course how Paul Mackenzie's been tried, is under the extremism laws. But what is looking at them through this lens of the separationist legacy do in terms of our practical politics and how we, on the ground, how we regulate or respond to these kinds of movements?
President McAleese.
Thank you to all the panelists. This is absolutely fascinating. My question is really directed to Jethro and to Rebecca. My head is spinning, quite frankly, as a Northern Irish Catholic, with the idea that two Ulster Scotsmen, McKinley and his successor Roosevelt, who grew out of a tradition probably best exemplified today by someone like the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, hugely anti-Catholic. British Empire, I mean, they grew out of Empire, Ulster Scots, massively anti-Catholic, that they would do anything by way of collaboration with Catholics that wasn't based on pure pragmatic cynicism, that there had to be another parallel agenda, that agenda about the Protestantizing of the Philippines, the Anglicization, the introduction of English to the Philippines. Is it just the case? I mean, at the end of the day, by the time they take an interest in the Philippines, the Spanish are already embedded 300 years. The Spanish Catholic Church is already embedded 300 years. Can you explain to me, I mean, am I wrong to be cynical about this collaboration? All colonizers need good collaborators. They all need good collaborators. And here was an organization that could give them access to very important statistics and cohorts. So I'm just wondering if in back, I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the Thomasites at the same time. How do you reconcile my cynicism, if you like, with that reality?
Thank you. I'm going to ask Jacob to go first.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael and Erin. So how do we think about the religious claims they were making, and do these religious claims have a vision of a depoliticized world, a reformed world? I think it's something actually that I could see in their work but did not so much engage. So I return to right now to one of their texts. There are two major books they wrote, but one of them written by one Henry Byarugaba. One of the things he was emphasizing is that their Marian visions were being disputed because they were blacks. And so that was the racialized thinking. It was a critique of the racial thinking of the Catholic Church back in Uganda, because they said, we too blacks can have Marian visions. They emphasized that. However, if they manage to transcend the tribal provocation, I don't see it in the work. So in its absence in the work, perhaps we could say it is a form of it, because they were not thinking in those, they were writing for a universal church, However, they begin with here a criticism of the disputation of their Marian claims. So you could think, I can go to it and think through it. And to air in the question of how do we respond to Shakahola if we are not going to respond to it through the lens of criminality. So, what does criminality do? The lens of criminality has the unfortunate implication of perpetuating these separations, because you have identified this individual as a criminal. What's the solution? Take him to prison. You're separating them further from the society without understanding the reasons for which they did what you have not biographed them to understand from where do they come. The question I was asking in the I wrote was this opinion piece that was asked of us, was trying to think this individual of the who led the Shakahola movement massacre had been a wretched of the earth in Frantz Fanon's idea of the wretched, but somehow miraculously emerged out of the shackles of poverty, of misery, and become successful. And he can't understand this transformation. All he can say is amazing grace. And he wants to teach the people, to tell the people about this amazing grace he has found in Christ. And many join. There are many people very rich, but struggling in their individual lives with taxes, they begin businesses and states close them down. There are many, the post-colonial world suffers many afflictions. So these afflictions, people have found solutions in religion. And the question the state needs to ask most is, why do people find solutions in religion more than they do find solutions in us, the state that claim to be welfare states? How do we think about this contradiction? So if you just remove someone and from the society, extend them further, banishment it just reproduces. You have left many of him in the society, and that is going to reproduce that same violence. So how do we think? I think how we think is to not be, not that the criminal justice system does not have its advantages, it does. But to say, let's not rush to label as criminal these individuals. Let's understand how we have produced them. How none of us is born a criminal. I think the circumstances we live make us criminal. We become criminals. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Before I hand over to Jethro, please remember you can still formulate questions, comments, etc. We guard if Jethro takes us into 4 minutes. We still have 25 minutes left.
Yes, I will answer very briefly. I will answer Mary's question first. You're right to be cynical because none of these things were happening in public. And that was part of the whole myth, is that we want to keep up appearances of, yeah, we're anti-Catholic, we're Protestant, but the sources are abundant that say, oh yes, they were collaborating, they were bedfellows. And the example of this would be the Taft mission to the Vatican from June to July 1902. So William Howard Taft, civil governor of the Philippines, in 1908, the president of the US, came to the Vatican at the behest of the Roosevelt administration to negotiate with the Sacra Congregazione dei Affari Ecclesiastici Straordinari, which is a defunct congregation already, but basically that congregation was in charge of diplomatic policy, the Vatican's diplomatic policy. So they were negotiating with them in the sweltering Roman heat. I don't know why they chose June or July to do that when everyone was out of the city. But anyway, there was like an explicit project on the part of the administration. They took pains to depict this as purely a business matter. And in fact, if you look at the current literature on the Taft mission to the Vatican, lots of scholars take the US press release at face value. In fact, David Alvarez, in his 1982 Diplomatic History article, in fact, he uses that as the title of the Taft mission, purely a business matter. But then in my work, I show that that was a part of the myth-making, because they were trying to be very careful about public opinion in the US mainland. So I hope that sort of gave you a sense of what I'm doing. To Michael's push for my defense of the Catholic Empire, we still won't be agreeing. We'll not see eye to eye on this. But my quick answer to that is because I'm looking at it not from the perspective of the metropole, but from the perspective of the periphery. Now, that sort of strategy changes the entire field of questions that could be raised. You're no longer just looking at like a programmatic set of norms that come from, for example, in times past, from Madrid, right? When Madrid was formulating, Madrid and the Vatican, they were, inventing the patronato. That was coming from the metropole. But if you really translate that to the peripheries, it's quite different. In Madrid, they were thinking of, almost a stranglehold on the church. But if you look at the colonial peripheries, the rules were not being applied. In fact, in a journal article that I'm sort of editing now, hopefully I could retract it, because the journal that initially requested it, they're forcing me to sort of reduce it to 8,000 words. But I was saying there that there was such an incoherence in the colonial project of Spain. And I think I want to sort of put that same level, or put the US and Spain on the same plane of analysis, make them comparable, because in that way we also question the exceptionalism of the US, right? Not just what we talk about in the media and all of that, but also in scholarship. There's a tendency to exceptionalize. So if once we take a much global approach to US history, then the questions are quite different. Now, lastly, with Tim's question, yes, I'm very much interested in Cuba and Puerto Rico. In fact, I'm drafting another journal article that compares Puerto Rico and Cuba. And it's not a very sexy topic, but I want to foreground church property. That's it. That's the one big question that was on the mind of the US and the Vatican at that time. There were divergences in the way that the US was governing these new colonies, and that's a well-documented fact. For example, Filipinos and Puerto Ricans, they were not accorded the same status as US citizens, despite the fact that they were under US dominion. And we could see this also with Spain. We were not Spanish citizens, and the liberal sort of laws of Spain were not applied to the Philippines. It was the same with the US. And with church property, we see that it's very difficult for me to go to Cuba without incurring the wrath of the US government to do research. But fortunately, we have all of the documents on church property issues in the Archdiocese of La Habana. They are all in the US National Archives. And it's fascinating because Leonard Wood, the military governor of Cuba, presided over the resolution of these property cases. And just last one thing, that's the final thing that I want to make, is that church property was quite essential because in 1908, the US Supreme Court decided on a church property case in the municipality of Ponce in Puerto Rico. So the question was, was the parish church, did the parish church belong to the municipality or to the bishop? So the way that the US Supreme Court decided on that, the doctrines that they used to decide on that, were based on a similar case that was decided in the Philippines. So you see the circulation of all these ideas across the empire.
Thank you very much, Jethro. I want, if our two mentors have quick reactions, we'll take a 1 minute reaction and then we go for the next set of questions.
Jethro obviously, can defend and kind of respond to those questions very kind of ably himself, but I just want to kind of add to what he sort of said on a couple of these points. One, back to Mary's question, it is, I think I definitely understand your project to suggest highly cynical kind of operators on the part of the US, but I think I also sort of learned from your project, Jethro, that I think that the American kind of Catholic Church had stakes, and sort of this was in part kind of your response to we were talking about kind of what happens in the US as a consequence of what happens in the Philippines. Kind of American kind of Catholic leadership sort of seeing kind of an opportunity too. So just to sort of say there's some agency I want to sort of suggest that I think your project implies on the part of American kind of Catholic leadership in seeing an opportunity in the Philippines too. So not just sort of cynical operators on the part of the Protestant elected leadership, but also I think in the American Catholic leadership too. And I think maybe one other thing that I really kind of love about your project, Jethro, is how much I think we understand that the local really kind of, I'll put that in scare quotes because I think that can be a problem, but really kind of matters. The colony really matters, and identities get scrambled, projects get sort of scrambled in the colonial kind of context, and so partners that you never sort of see being kind of worked out on the mainland have to be kind of negotiated and made in the context of the colony. So we kind of, there's plenty of kind of literature that shows us that about kind of racial ideologies that weren't easily exported from the US out to the Philippines or kind of elsewhere. And likewise, I think in terms of like kind of racial, or rather religious kind of relationships around kind of religion have to be sort of worked out as the, kind of the challenges of governance confront American colonial officials. And I think your work really sort of shows us that, how we have to attend to the local, and it then consequently then has these implications for what happens back in the metropole. And real quick, I just, back to sort of Michael's question, I've thinking about that. I've not really weighed in on the Catholic Empire kind of question myself in conversations we've had. But I suppose the only thing I would sort of say on that is I wonder if, is Catholic colony the other way, is our, is that another way to put it? Somehow that seems kind of less provocative and sexy than kind of Catholic Empire. But there's a part of me that sort of thinks that what you're ultimately kind of showing us here is it's a colonial kind of history. And so my Catholic colony, but again, I think that doesn't have quite the punch that kind of Catholic Empire kind of gives us.
Thank you, Rebecca. Emmanuel?
Well, just briefly, I think what Jacobo responded to in terms of the kind of the imaginations within the kind of the movement, theology, inner theology. Where I see, and he has a beautiful chapter on the creation of a new diocese in Western Uganda, and the controversies around who will become bishop, and that's kind of really connected with the whole question of identity. Who is really a son of the soil, or where do these people belong? So there is all these kind of questions about belonging, but there is also something that comes through this work in terms of understanding the movement, in terms of trying to reimagine Christianity. There is a deep secularizing force in terms of trying to imagine religion as only concerned with spiritual matters of the soul. What movements like the expression of the Ten Commandments of God show, and you can see it within their struggles with their spirituality and practice, is to reimagine religion beyond the spiritual. It's very material. It's about the body. It's about possessions, property, sex. It's all the kind of things that are kind of really, that usually from a kind of a secularized version of religion that should be either private or not part of the saving of the soul. I think there is also that kind of struggle. What should Christianity be all about? And in the millennialist kind of visions of the movement followers, you can see that kind of attempt to reimagine God in a way, becoming through the vision of Mary, becoming supreme, not only over one's inner soul, but also different bodily disciplines. So again, kind of confirming that it is Christianity or religion is at the same time a politics, and that's where the entanglement comes in, that claim that no, we cannot just restrict ourselves to only select areas of life that is the control of everything, the whole discipline of the body.
Thank you. I see 3 questions at the back. Start with a question over there, followed by the others. Please give your names and to whom your question is directed. We got 17 minutes, about 16 because I have to say a closing prayer. No. Thank you.
My name is Thao Ngim. I'm doing my PhD at the University of Groningen, the Netherlands, and one of the participants in the Rome Summer Seminars this year. My question is for Jethro. Jethro, thanks for all the panelists for your exciting, fascinating work. And Jethro is both exciting and motivating to see your presentation 2 years ago and how it developed into the book project like it is today. I appreciate your argument of this trans-imperial movement when the US stepped in and exploit the infrastructure to develop its Catholic empire. But I mean, what seems rather absent or rather passive in your presentation is the emergence or development of the Filipino national church. And at least in the Vietnamese case, is a real problem for the French colonial church when at least young Catholic seminarians start passing around anti-colonial pamphlets and singing anti-colonial songs, for example. And I know that you touched a little bit on this in your answer just now, but could you elaborate a little bit more on this development, and since what moment did this emergence and development of the Filipino national movement and church itself become an issue and destabilizing factor for this imperial project that you're describing? Thank you.
Your name, sir? I didn't get it.
Your name? How?
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 Next question, please.
Hi, thank you all panelists for an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. My name is Yash. I'm also one of the participants of the Rome Summer Seminar, and I work on Hindu nationalist political movement in the Indian case. And my question was for Jacob, and it follows some of the closing comments from Professor Katongole about, as in contextualizing or placing this kind of religious violence within the broader rubric of political violence writ large. And I was curious as to what you think about that category, especially because if we think about these movements and the consequences in terms of violence within this broader temporal continuum of political violence, does that disturb in some ways the story you're telling us about what you call in your op-ed the unreformed state and the failure of state capacity as producing in some ways this violence? Or is that unreformed state also a product of legacies of political violence itself, both colonial and post-colonial? So if we think through the category of political violence, what does that tell us about these things, especially as we try to move beyond these conjunctures of violence in the case that you're talking about? Thank you.
Thank you, Ash. Third question there. There's another hand. Yes.
Yes. Good morning. I'm Simon Polinder from Utrecht University, the Netherlands. Can I ask 2 questions, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please. Keep it short.
I've been involved in the similar project as Aaron Wilson, the GISRA project, and so we interviewed about 150 religious leaders in Nigeria and Kenya on how they deal with violent extremism. And one of the things that I found out in the literature is that people said, if you want to think about the role of religion in African countries, you have to think about 2 public spheres. So there's this colonial public sphere with this Western separation of church and state, and there's this public sphere with the indigenous spiritual religious relationship with the public life. So I'm very curious, Emmanuel and Jake, if you can reflect on that idea. And the other question is, on political theology, and the reason is that I'm organizing a conference in December on Christian democracy and international relations in the Netherlands. Call for papers is out, you're all welcome. But is there any inspiration, is it possible to draw inspiration from this political philosophy of Christian democracy for dealing with religion and politics in public life in some African countries? I've been researching a little bit on it, still looking for it, so take the opportunity of people here from Africa with expertise on Africa to ask this question.
Can you repeat the last questions about the role of political theology? There's a conference in the Netherlands sometime in December. I'm repeating the question. He asked me, so I want to see if I heard it correctly. And whether you see any place for political theology in dealing with international relations, correct?
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't really clear. Is it possible to draw inspiration from this Christian democratic tradition, very European or Western tradition, in Africa to develop this political theology? And the reason is I've been looking for a speaker from Africa to help us reflect from an African perspective on Christian democracy. I found it quite hard to find someone, so I thought, is there any relationship between these two traditions on the level of political theology?
Thank you. I can think of a couple of names I can tell you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. One more question. One more. That's the only one I can allow. Yes, sir. Tahir?
Okay.
No, you have to have the mic. It's for recording purposes. Rose will be very angry if you don't.
Jethro and Jacob, we have been following your work and it's wonderful. I'm Tahir Jamal, one of the Ansari Fellows. One question for Jacob and one question for Jethro. Jethro, somewhere you were mentioning the definition of secularism you are trying to reinterpret or re-articulate, which is already there. But I am still wondering, what can be the definition of secularism if we say it is the exercise of power by state over religion? If we simply say it is the exercise of power and you are emphasizing US as the Catholic empire, as well as you are also trying to say, trying to separate nation and state. In that sense, if we see these empires also as states, if at all possible, then all these empires who try to exercise their power also will be secular in that sense. But can we actually call them secular? In that sense, even Catholic empire, is that a secular empire? And even, I would say, even if Abbasid Caliphate trying to exert their power over religion, but is that secular? I think secular has to be defined quite in a different way, where the state tries to locate religion in a particular way. Otherwise, it will be a bit more broadening, I think. And following from that, Jacob, your work also again a fascinating work which we have been following. When you say this mass suicide as a result of post-colonial nation-state conditions or all this political violence of colonialism and post-colonialism, etc., are we also trying to say that it is impossible to go beyond this colonial violence other than through suicide? Or we are always already in these conditions so that there is no escape possible other than by dying?
Thank you very much. There are 4 questions on the table. Jethro, why don't you go?
I'll be quick.
Yes,
so to Tao's question on the Philippine Independent Church, I deal with that in the current project very much so, because the founding of the Philippine Independent Church was really a reaction to what was perceived by a lot of Filipino Catholics as this US Vatican collusion. The Philippine Independent Church continues today, as the Anglican Church, very nationalistic. They're in communion with the Anglican Communion through the Episcopal Church. but I also want to make a distinction because there were also lots of Filipino Roman Catholics who did not join the Philippine Independent Church. And so they were able to negotiate in their minds, how do we deal with these, regime change, and sort of remain Catholic. That's the subject of like the first part of the book, first 2 chapters of the book that, thank God, I've completed before coming here. To Tahir's question on secularism, now that is a long-term project that I'm trying to do. It's because I'm not a scholar of religion, I'm a historian. And I'm really treading on very dangerous waters, and a lot of people will attack me for it. But I call, for example, the Patronato Real of Spain as an archaic form of secularism, precisely because I really believe in the definition of secularism as state control of religion. Now, how that happens in other empires, in other contexts, remains to be seen, and that is why I'm quite excited to move from this current project, first book and second book, and then broaden the scope to probably talk about my initial instinct was to look at the Patronato in Southeast Asia, so in Southeast Asia and South Asia, because I want to look at Goa, because the Portuguese were there, and the Strait Settlement, and the Philippines, and to compare them and what that tells us about secularism. The other option would be to compare Spain and England, because in the 16th century, as the Patronato of Spain was being invented, you have the Church of England being, formed by Henry VIII and subsequently by his heir, not Mary Tudor, but Elizabeth I. So you have that same dynamic going on in the 16th century, and I sort of want to see if there's something to be said there. Right now, I have nothing to say to that. I think you're perfectly right to critique me, but I have a hunch that there is something to be said. Probably I'll look at an Islamic empire as a comparator, but we'll see if I could learn Arabic.
Inshallah. That would be a great contribution to the field.
Thank you so much, friends. Thank you, Yash. How do we think about this if we also think with the category of political violence? So when religious actors engage in acts of violence, it's easily dismissed as political violence. This is senseless violence. It's not political violence. It's always dismissed because the state tends to retain the power to inflict violence. So that's the violence that is imagined as sensible violence. So the violence of religious actors is easily dismissed as senseless. I think if I was to use that term in the work, I would be fighting with political scientists, some of them. So, but it's a category that we could extend because I'm trying to say these people have political grievances from which they rise to perpetuate acts of violence. Yeah, so good. Then thank you for that question on, you made my head continue to spin about this sphere, the public, the colonial public sphere, the indigenous public sphere. This binary is something we could think with. However, I would want to put a disclaimer and say, when you think about the nature, what is the content of the indigenous public sphere in Africa? It is conscripted in the colonial flourish because the indigenous, as is today, is one that is rigidified as an identity. It does not allow. It is not fluid as it used to be pre-colonial. Does that make sense? So when you think about the category in our modern imagination of things, it collapses. And then the question of Christian democracies, I think I would want to give my mentor to answer. He has written a lot on it.
Well, first of all, I want to take a piece from your last comment about the indigenous. Everything we see in Africa today is very modern. What we are looking at is modern Africa. There is a unique modernity within which these so-called native, traditional, tribal realities have already been inscripted. The challenge is, how do we understand this unique modernity that is operative in Africa? It is a disservice when violence erupts and we say, well, that's tribal violence, that's ethnic violence, kind of condemning it to the primitive past. That this is where what Africans do now and again in their... This is a very modern phenomenon that we are experiencing in Africa. Tribalism and tribe today is a very modern, unique reality in Africa. It's not pre-modern, a nativist, a native, indigenous. It's very modern. It is within the very framework of the post-colonial modernity that all these realities have now been inscripted, and they operate in a unique way, not in the kind of this pristine, indigenous, native. I think we need to understand that, and I think that's the beginning of really engaging in the political. This is not to say that everything in Africa is political, but of course everything is political. Politics about the control and the regulation of bodies in space and time. You see? So let's move beyond the kind of naivete, especially when it comes to Africa. That there is a modern, colonial, post-colonial reality, and then there is a nativist kind of indigenous. It's very, very modern, unique modernity. So this is where I think the whole question of Christian democracy, I think, can come in. I'm not sure what is Christian democracy. You kind of mean the kind of the European forms of Christian democracy? Of course, those are being engaged in Africa. The whole political frameworks, the whole horizon of political, theological contributions that engage this whole question of governance or politics in Africa from different angles. Some want to contribute in a way, for example, to help democracy work, to contribute to ways of mediation, of reconciliation, of reconstruction. This is what Christians ought to do if they want democracy to work, if you want Kenya to become more democratic and things like that. There are a whole plethora of contributions along those trajectories. Others work from a more spiritualistic kind of point of view, that the only way that democracy can work in Africa is to engage in deeper spirituality, convert people more, let them be born again. The whole Pentecostal, evangelical kind of paradigm, in a way, is that if we could have more Christian leaders, then maybe the whole space in Africa will become more democratic and transparent. There are others, like myself, who have argued that actually what we need is a reimagination of the political in Africa. Of course, if you're reading it from the lens of Christian democracy in Africa, in America, in the West, in Europe, that might not sound like it's contributing to Christian democracy, but it is actually doing the kind of deeper, more fundamental political work that I feel is needed to reinvent this post-colony that we are living in. The necropolitics, the politics of death. That it is this ongoing politics of death.
Fantastic.
That it does not just require contributions to make this space kind of work more transparent and so forth. It needs a deeper reimagining of what it means to live together in this new dispensation. So there's a lot of, and you and I can talk over the break there, but there are a lot of contributions that we can draw from in all those paradigms.
You got your 2 minutes and you're on fire. So that's great, that's great, that's great. Thank you very much to all our panelists, for our mentors, for our two presenters, for their excellent work, the provocations that we had here this morning. In this first session, I hope I did a good job. Please fill in the response of how well I did as moderator. But basically, two things that I will just summarize as. One, I see a kind of disciplinary divide. Religious studies, ethnographic studies, and anthropology on the one hand, and the comeback of theology, especially political theology, of how I would see, if we had a conversation on Boko Haram and there was a Muslim theologian on the panel who would have said similar things of criminality and so on and so forth. So I think there's a divide there, and we have to overcome. The other thing is about the place of history and religion. I don't think you can only be a historian, Jethro, and just say I'm a historian. You also study religion. You're very good at religion. So I think that's a great a meeting point, and the interdisciplinary nature of both of your projects is just phenomenal. Since you were on fire, let me close with a poem by Shakil Balayouni, a Indian poet who wrote in Urdu, died in 1970. Scott knows I like to end on poetry. My aspiration is so high, I do not fear the burning coals left by adversaries. My aspiration is so high, I do not fear the burning coals left by adversaries. I do indeed tremble at the fire of the rose. Dreading its blaze will torch the entire garden. Thank you very much.